Two and a Half Admins, episode 207. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. Secure Boot is broken on 200 plus models from 5 big device makers.
Yeah, so researchers from security firm Binarily revealed that Secure Boot is completely compromised on more than 200 device models sold by companies like Acer, Dell, Gigabyte, Intel, and Supermicro. The cause being that the cryptographic keys that underpin Secure Boot for those models were compromised back in 2022 in a public GitHub repository accidentally committed to in December of that year. Someone working for multiple US-based device manufacturers published what's known as the platform key. It's a cryptographic key that basically forms the root of trust for deciding which signatures are to be trusted. And with that, you could go ahead and sign a virus binary, and the machine would decide to load that instead of the Windows kernel and be like, yep, that's totally what's supposed to be happening.
The best part is the keys that the manufacturers still keep using are literally labeled CN equals do not trust. And much like my not always entirely popular hate for Btrfs and its broken RAID modes, I'm just going to say again, when like the people who are responsible for a thing tell you this is broken, don't use it, don't freaking use it. If the key says don't trust, don't sign things with that key. If the RAID mode says, do not use, don't use it. This shouldn't be that hard.
So what this comes down to is in the BIOS binary, there's a root of trust, which is similar to the list of certificate authorities to trust that's built into your browser and your operating system. And AMI has some test keys that they label do not trust and do not ship that are designed to be used during testing of the motherboard and make sure Secure Boot accepts this certificate, not that one. But those ones are not meant to be left in the trust store when you ship the firmware. And it turns out they were, meaning that these keys that were labeled do not trust and they were spread all over the place and people could sign binaries with them would suddenly be trusted instead of not. So they're not the only keys, but in the list of keys, it was there and it really shouldn't have been. It just goes to show the amount of care and attention that goes into building the firmware images that are the root of Secure Boot is not very high.
The problem here is that security really always needs to come from very firmly defined and spelled out policy. You really can't just have security be a thing that the one guy does and, you just do whatever the one guy said, because what ultimately happens is most people either don't understand or don't care about all the intricacies of what you need to do in order to make a secure product. So they just stop bothering at some point unless there is an actual policy both for them to follow and for somebody else to make certain that they followed. If you don't have that, this is inevitably what happens. What we're seeing now with Secure Boot is essentially the same thing that, we saw from router manufacturers a few years ago. Remember when every router came from the factory and you just needed admin and password to get into it? And now, sure, they would print in the instructions for the router that the first thing you needed to do was change that password. How many people did that? Answer? Basically, nobody. So you wound up with, an entire world packed full of consumer routers that anybody could get into if they could remember admin and password. And the only way that ever got resolved was through serious policy initiatives saying it is not okay to ship these devices with default passwords. They must have individually per device unique, passwords or passphrases. And when you have that policy and you implement it and you check it, then you can be certain that things will get done right. When you don't do the work with the policy, you wind up with things like this. You wind up with cryptographic keys labeled do not trust that are used in production. You wind up with admin and password to get into the router. It's exactly what we're looking at.
Yeah, well, in here, it's also a little bit of, not nobody's fault, but nobody's taking responsibility for this. So the way firmware generally gets built is not as straightforward as you would think. So in general, there's a couple of companies that make the base firmware. In the example here, it's AMI, American Megatrends, I think it was. And they make the BIOS for most major brands of computer, including Gigabyte and Dell and Supermicro. So they build a reference firmware, which is not actually usable by anything, but it's here's the basic firmware. And then they sell that to your Gigabytes, your Dells, and your Supermicros, who then take that and modify it and add their gunk and put their logos on it and make the BIOS look like their BIOS. And they're supposed to run all these CI/CD tests and test using these do not trust, do not ship keys and make sure everything works, and then take those keys out of the trust store. When they do a production build, those keys don't get trusted, and they make a firmware image, and then maybe that goes to the user. But also you get companies that build appliances or specialized things, right? Gigabyte makes motherboards they sell to people, but they also make customized motherboards where they sell it on to somebody to build an appliance. And so then Gigabyte gives their adulterated version of that firmware to a third company who then makes more changes to the way the BIOS works and ships it. And anywhere in that chain, if somebody doesn't follow the instructions correctly and not ship the do not trust keys, then all the leaked do not trust keys get shipped. And so there's multiple points where this could have been prevented, and it wasn't at every single one of them.
Remember the malware a few months ago that could infect the image file that the UEFI firmware would use to have the last hardware manufacturer in the supply chain to put their logo on there. It would load that image file, and that image file was unsigned, and there was an error in the image parser that interpreted that image.
Buffer overflow.
Yep, and you could use that to own the firmware. So we're back in that same territory with like nobody's really taking it seriously. I would argue that it's a symptom of some real sickness in the industry when you have this clear preference for it needs to look like my thing. And the important thing is it has my logo and it has my personal stank on it. And more people are viewing that as important than viewing the actual security of the firmware as important.
Yeah. It reminds me of the one we covered months and months ago about the keys for one set of phones, where it turned out like 9 different manufacturers had all been using the same key to sign everything. And so when that key got compromised, every phone that every one of these 9 manufacturers made in the last 5 years could basically be tricked in almost the same way as this vulnerability. And again, this one is somebody found some stuff that somebody had hacked or whatever, and they threw it up on GitHub, and it turns out, oh, this actually contains the secret keys for signing stuff for BIOSes for all these manufacturers. It's like, maybe every one of these manufacturers should only have their own key, and that there should be no key that comes from AMI. There should only be the one key from Supermicro that works on these out of the box. But nope, not how it happens.
Maybe countries with massive economies and technical presences, maybe they should have government departments that are red teaming devices like this to find these kinds of issues ahead of time, because clearly you can't rely on the company that makes it to do it.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like we talked about the cyber trust mark and maybe finally getting, again, back to what you're talking about with routers, like really enforcing that no default passwords and that there will be security updates and so on. Can we have that for big, expensive servers too? Not just cheap home routers they sell at Walmart?
Maybe can we also have it for just regular old home computers, you know? I don't think it's that unreasonable that somebody who expects that they're getting secure boot on a motherboard should in fact have secure boot and not, quote, secure, unquote. And believe me, dear listener, I am doing the scare quotes with great malice here. Because how secure is your secure boot when it's signed with a key that literally says PK do not trust?
Well, in this case, I don't think it was signed with that key, but that key was on the trust list. So anything signed with that key would be trusted. And that's the problem. But still, yes. Obviously, nobody even ran an eye over the list of trusted certificates and didn't notice the do not trust in all uppercase.
Amazon's paid Alexa is coming to fill a $25 billion hole dug by Echo devices. This is a bit of a head scratcher to me. We've all known that these voice assistants are not returning anywhere near the investment that Google, Amazon, Apple have spent on them. But instead of just shit-canning Alexa, Amazon is doubling down, adding Gen AI, and they are planning to start charging people to use an upgraded version of Alexa. This is going to be a cost on top of your Prime subscription. I just can't see this working somehow.
I don't see it working either, but that doesn't stop people from giving it a shot. I mean, who with any sense, and I know we're going to piss off a few listeners here, but who with any sense ever looked at NFTs with any level of detail and said, yeah, that's a good idea, and we as a society should invest millions, if not billions, in this. It's going to be great. It's going to transform the entire world. Nobody with any sense looked at that and thought it was anything other than a giant pile of shit, but we did it anyway. Why did we do it? Because, it was the thing, and you do the thing that is the thing at the time that it's the thing. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing with Gen AI right now. It's the big buzz, it's the big hype. There are a lot of people with a lot of money and a lot of skill in pushing narratives, pushing the narrative that generative AI is going to change the world. A lot of those exact same people were the ones who were pushing, NFTs as the beginning of Web3 that would change the world not that many years before that.
Yeah, although at the same time, I've been trying to get my computer to do what I tell it to for 25 years. But actually saying, computer, do the thing, like on Next Generation Star Trek, that's the thing I've wanted. And it's getting closer and closer to being there. It feels like with most of those voice assistants, they were always kind of just stalling, waiting for more of a Gen AI thing to get there so that they could actually understand what you were asking and do more than Google search for the keywords that they think you said. And so it might not be as big of a dead end, but I definitely see the ChatGPT type thing combined with the voice assistant as actually getting to be more useful than the voice assistants were by themselves. And people are paying subscriptions for the generative AI stuff. And so there might be a market there.
There might for a little while, but I would like to go ahead and make the distinction with some clarity that not all AI is generative AI. And, when I'm railing against AI, I'm mostly talking about the generative stuff and specifically large language models. The image generative stuff is also not ideal, but the LLM stuff is the absolute worst of the bunch because, people are misled into thinking that this is human level answers to my human level questions. And it's really not. It's a word predictor trying to predict the thing that most humans would be the most pleased by if it follows up the words you said with more words. Mm-hmm. And all you can ever get out of that is a sort of gestalt of most of the technological consuming portion of the human race, their opinion on a thing. It's never going to be smarter than that because the way you train these large language models is not, let's make sure that it only ever hears correct answers to sensible questions. The way they're trained is let's throw just a giant grab bag of every random bit of human conversation we can find into it and let it figure it out. Mm-hmm. And so part of the issue there is those things are nowhere near as bright as most humans think that they are. But the bigger issue to my mind, and the reason I'm not excited about all this in the way that you described, Alan, is that it's not the computer from Star Trek. The computer from Star Trek was pre all of the AI stuff in neural networks, and it was envisioned by people who were familiar with traditional formal logic programming using Boolean logic where you get the same result every time because you actually understood the problem space and you wrote an algorithm from scratch that modeled the thing that you wanted to model. There wasn't garbage and bullshit in it. Humans understood the whole thing the whole way through. And that's not what generative AI is. Generative AI is essentially a really, really stupid digital organism, and it makes a lot of the same mistakes in a lot of the same ways that organic organisms do. Because again, it is and I'm really using the scare quotes hard here, it is a mind that evolves much like a human mind does, and it has lots of bad data in it. And that's why you see things like you get better answers to math questions out of ChatGPT if you talk sweet to it and tell it, take your time and think about this, or, I believe in you, or, all the things that grade school teachers would say to human children to encourage them that produce better results in the human children. They also work on the models. And the reason they work on the models is because the models didn't just train on correct answers. They trained on the correct answers and the incorrect answers. And so if asking a question a certain way is more likely for a human to answer it correctly, it's also going to be more likely for the large language model to answer it correctly because, again, it was trained on both good and bad data. And as long as that's the case, it's not what I want. I do like that I can talk to a device and have it understand the words that I'm saying, but beyond that part, the less AI and the more formal logic, the happier I'm going to be.
The reason that I find this a head scratcher is that I don't think people are going to pay Amazon for these smart speakers in their house when Google and Apple are baking this shit into their phones and tablets and laptops to some extent. Why would you pay a subscription service for something that your phone can already do or will do around the same time as this paid Alexa thing comes out?
The same reason that you would buy an Echo when you already have a phone and you can run the Amazon app on your phone and use the Alexa. You can use your phone to run Alexa and you can speak to it and it does all the same things that an Echo would. So why would you buy an Echo? Well, you'd buy it for the hardware because it's actually got a deep field array of mics that can understand voices from all around the room, whereas you pretty much need to talk into your phone. There are a lot of reasons to want that. And so that gets down and again, okay, but who would spend the monthly fee? Well, it's just the same deal. You're just saying, why would you spend that money every month versus why would you spend it once? And the answer would be because you want the features that came with that hardware thing. And in some cases that might be, maybe Amazon does a really amazing job and maybe they actually have a more capable model trained on better data that you have to pay a monthly subscription for, and that makes it worthwhile. Or maybe it's literally just, well, I've had an Echo in my device for the last 5 years and I've come to depend on it. Now it costs a few dollars every month to have it. And I'll just pay that rather than deal with uprooting all that and trying to replace all the hardware and figure out a new platform and ecosystem and everything else to do all my flaming crap on.
The thing is, it looks like if the rumors are true, the bog standard Alexa is still going to be available for free on these smart devices. And it's just a paid upgrade.
Sure.
It really depends on the feature set and what people are using it for. Right? If you're using it to turn on and off the lights, maybe it works fine now, but maybe with better AI, it would understand what you were saying better, or just interpret your commands more effectively, or maybe be able to make better recommendations or something. But maybe, yeah, for most people's use case, it doesn't matter. And if you're asking it questions that it's going to use generative AI to answer, you're probably using it wrong in the first place. I don't know.
There's also the distinct possibility, and I want to make clear here, this is purely hypothetical and speculation about a thing that could be done, not an accusation of things being done. But one thing I think that you're missing here, Joe, is there's a huge captive element here. Let's say that Amazon, releases the paid for, and they make APIs available for the paid for Alexa that integrate and learn skills for various third-party devices. Now, if you're the third-party device manufacturer, you would need to choose to use that API that required the paid subscription. But we see over and over and over again that a lot of the times, these like last leg companies that build devices, they will cheerfully choose to build things based on APIs that, have annoying encumbrances to them. And if you have enough of these third-party device manufacturers that decide, you know what, it makes our life easier if we use this Amazon API that we don't have to pay for, but our customers will, well, then that just becomes de facto. And now all of a sudden there's a huge range of hardware that if you're not paying Amazon money for, you don't get to use it. And now if this scenario isn't sounding familiar to you yet, allow me to ask you the question. Why do almost all the games in the world rely on DirectX? Because it's a really handy API that Microsoft made available to developers for free, but you, the consumer, have to buy a copy of Windows then, not just if you want to use Windows, but if you want to play that game.
Part of it is also just the type of people that buy the Echo devices are kind of those technology early adopters. And so they will pay for things even if they're not getting that much out of them. They just want to be the one that has it first and just yell at the computer to open the blinds and it'll open the blinds.
To me, it seems like sunk cost fallacy squared, really, because Amazon have already invested all these billions into Alexa, and it's not given them any returns. And so they should just cut their losses, but instead they've got this sunk cost fallacy that they need to just keep going and eventually it'll make money. And then you've got generative AI, which is also a sunk cost at this point. Like, all these companies are spending billions and billions of dollars on it, and it's just, it's making them some revenue for the people who are willing to pay for the upgraded version or whatever of ChatGPT. But ultimately, they're not making a return. And that return, I don't think will ever come. And they should just cut their losses.
The people that are offering the usage of these AI models for, quote, free, unquote, aren't seeing a big return on their investment. But the companies out there that spin up a copy of Midjourney or, whatever image generative AI and charge you like $10 or $20 a month to use it, they're quite profitable. They're not having any problem getting the return on revenue, and Amazon is actually trying to do that. They're going from the idea that, we'll just bake AI into the thing and not charge you directly for it, but somehow money to, hey, turns out this crap costs us money, so we should get money in return. Now, whether they're correct or not that people will pay money for that, I don't know. We do know that people absolutely will pay money for subscriptions to, things like Midjourney. Maybe they'll pay money for this, maybe they won't. The other thing is, it doesn't necessarily have to take the entire world by storm. And I strongly suspect they're not going to invest anywhere near the amount of money in like the mild upgrade to the existing Alexa model to add whatever features that you have to pay for. I don't think it's going to cost anywhere near as much as like building the Alexa model from scratch did in the first place. Because a lot of the costs that, we're talking about here they're not necessarily daily operation costs. They're research and development costs.
Yeah. And I think part of it is also they want to be the infrastructure provider, right? They're basically building the EC2 of AI. This is the hub devices in your house, and all the other companies that want to build something are going to connect to ours. And so being the one that was there first or gets to the next breakthrough first is where they see the payoff coming from, not from charging you $10 a month for better AI. It's about being the one that the indispensable cog in all of the other products.
I think there's also a big follow-on value for Amazon there in as long as they are a major AI player themselves, it gives AWS a sense of added legitimacy as a hosting provider for people who want to provide an AI product, because you're not asking yourself like, well, does Amazon really understand, my specialized needs as somebody who wants to spin up a bunch of AI stuff in the cloud, as opposed to a bunch of, just like old school services and websites, with traditional formal logic and development. And right now, you don't have to ask yourself that question. You know damn well Amazon knows what's up with AI. So there are definitely a lot of reasons, I think, for Amazon to stay current and like take that space seriously, because even above and beyond, like I said, the direct, like I sold a thing to you, they're selling far more expensive things to very large companies that could go by the wayside if those very large companies start thinking Amazon isn't current on AI.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by OnePassword. Imagine your company's security like the quad of a college campus. There are nice brick paths between the buildings. Those are company-owned devices, IT-approved apps, and managed employee identities. And then there are the paths people actually use, the shortcuts worn through the grass that are the actual straightest line from point A to B. Those are unmanaged devices, shadow IT apps, and non-employee identities like contractors. Most security tools only work on those happy brick paths, but a lot of security problems take place on the shortcuts. OnePassword Extended Access Management is the first security solution that brings all these unmanaged devices, apps, and identities under your control. It ensures that every user credential is strong and protected, every device is known and healthy, and every app is visible. OnePassword Extended Access Management solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. It's security for the way we work today, and it's available now to companies with Okta and coming later this year to Google Workspace and Microsoft Entra. So support the show and check it out at onepassword.com/25A. That's onepassword.com/25A. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an RSS feed with no ads that includes either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And you even get some episodes early. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Jonathan writes, do you have any tips for us normies on how to evaluate the legitimacy and safety of some of the free and open source software you might find on GitHub, which can be a bit confusing for non-developers?
My first advice here, and keep in mind, the question was asked by and for normies, not seriously technical people. So that is the question that I'm answering in that vein. And the very first thing you can do is essentially the same thing that you would do when you go shopping for like free games to play in your smartphone's, app store or market. You look and see how many people have installed it. Now, on GitHub, it's not actually installations, but you can see how many people have started a project or forked it and are following it. And that number is going to give you a good idea. Is this project really popular? Are there a whole lot of eyeballs on this? The more eyeballs that are on it, the more likely one of them will have noticed if something is bad, either because they are much more technical than you are, or they're not any more technical than you are, but they were there first, and the thing that would have affected you would have already affected them. So that's going to be the first biggest thing you can do. Beyond that, again, it's the same advice for if you were thinking about an app in a dodgy mobile market, beyond the right there on the page for it, like how many people have started, Google it. Find out, are people talking about it? If it looks like it's a big popular project on GitHub, there should be a lot of people talking about it off of GitHub. And when you put that project's name into a search engine, you should be seeing people talking about their experiences installing it, using it, reviewing it, what have you. If all you get is crickets, well, then you should start getting a little bit more concerned. Now, again, with that said, if you were a very technical person, that's not necessarily the answer that I would give you, because there are lots of projects on GitHub that are perfectly legitimate and very useful and just haven't really taken off yet. But from the perspective of a normie worried about security, that's just too far out on the edge for you.
Yeah. Other thing you can look at is the issues and pull requests. If there are a lot of issues that people are filing, then it means people are using it. If the issues are, this broke my computer, you maybe want to back off a little bit. But also, do the issues people file ever get any answers, right? Is this project actually alive, or is it kind of just a dead end? And so looking at, are pull requests getting actually taken care of? Are issues getting responded to? And, are people having issues? So if there's, some liveliness there and nobody's reporting problems, like malware or whatever, then it's probably okay. Whereas if it's a ghost town, then maybe you want to look a lot closer before you decide to do it. I've felt sketchy about it a couple times. Like the one was, I was using Microsoft Power Tools on my TV to remap some buttons on the keyboard or whatever. And Microsoft now hosts the downloads for that, like the executables on GitHub. And at first when it sent me to a link to GitHub to get an exe I was going to run on my computer, I was like, huh? And let's double check. Okay, this is actually the Microsoft account on GitHub and so on. But I can definitely understand why, as an end user, that's not the experience we were used to. And if you got sent to some random website, GitHub, that you're not a developer, you don't know much about, yeah, you should be double checking stuff before you start running that software.
And at the same time, again, because we're talking about, a question to ask by normies for normies, I don't want to overload you folks. So if you do nothing else, just look at that star count. If a project on GitHub has got, say, 1,000 stars and, 100 forks, the odds are fairly low that there's something dodgy going on there, because that implies, at the very least, tens of thousands of installations. And all those forks, like what the fork actually is, I don't know if there's anybody listening to this show that doesn't understand a software fork, but just in case, a fork is when you make your own copy of the repository for purposes of analyzing the code and possibly modifying it and learning to understand it better yourself. So if you've got 100 people that are invested at the level of doing that, now odds are pretty good, say 8 out of 10 of those people never actually did the first thing with that fork. They just forked it and walked away and never looked at it. But again, that's an indication that people who do know something about the code are looking at this carefully, not only running it, but also looking at the internals.
If you're on Linux, then it's definitely worth looking in your distro's repositories first to see if it's there. And if it is there in apt or DNF or whatever, then the chances are that someone will have at least had a cursory look over it before it was put into the distro.
I mean, they'll almost certainly have taken at least a cursory look, because the vast majority of the packages that show up in distributions, the packager for that repository is generally not the original developer of the software. It's somebody else who is themselves a developer and or sysadmin to some degree, who is interested enough in that project to package it and to get it in the repository and to keep taking care of it. So that's another indication of more people who know what they're doing who are looking at it. Is that a guarantee that it will be great? No, but it is, again, an excellent indication. The other thing, if you're a normie and you find that package in your operating system's native repositories, that's probably where you should be installing it from. It's going to be a lot easier to install. There will be less hassles to jump through. You'll get automatic updates and upgrades, none of which you'll get from cowboy installing code you found on GitHub. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no reason to install, the bleeding edge version straight from the vendor on GitHub when there's something in the repository. Sometimes your distribution's repository maintainers may not update the packages as quickly as you would prefer, and there may be features or bug fixes present in master on the GitHub repository that weren't there if, for example, you just said apt install Sanoid, to name some random project off the top of my head. But most people don't actually need that. Most of these projects are in perfectly usable condition in the repository, where they're, again, easier to install, automatic upgrades, both security and otherwise. And also, you have a few more eyeballs on the code, making sure that everything looks good.
And easier to remove if you don't like it, generally speaking. Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.